All right. Thank you very much, Marco. Yeah, so we've gone through and we hit on core cloud concepts and the Azure structure a couple weeks ago. Last week we did get into the core IaaS, storage, networking, and did hit on some of the database services. Actually, this week we're going to hit on some more of the platform services, as well as we're going to get into a little bit of security as well as some identity around Azure Active Directory. So those are going to be the core pieces that we're going to cover today. So for those of you who haven't attended one of my sessions before, Dwayne Natwick, I am a Microsoft Azure MVP. I work as a senior cloud training architect for Skill Me Up and Opsgility. And I am a Microsoft certified trainer and regional lead for that program. Feel free to follow me on the social media links on the slide. So as I was saying, we're going to hit into some of the serverless technology, and that's going to go into some of the big data services, the cognitive services, and then we're going to talk about identity management. We're going to talk about some security controls, and that's going to, the security controls and everything and tools are going to slide a little bit into next week's session as well, where we're getting a little bit more into governance and the Azure subscription. So let's jump in and talk about some of the core PaaS services that we haven't covered. We covered a few of them last week when we were talking about databases, when we were talking about Azure SQL and Cosmos DB, but some of the things around around some of the other serverless platform type services within the Azure environment, and one that's becoming more and more a big talking point is the Internet of Things. So some of the key things around that is the key services around Internet of Things is really IoT Central and IoT Hub. The IoT Central piece is really a fully managed SaaS solution for Internet of Things. So it has what it does is it connects, it monitors, and manages all of your IoT assets. So it can be utilized if you have a connected thermostat or a Raspberry Pi out there that's being used for retrieving some sort of telemetry data. IoT Central can be utilized to connect those services that are really third-party Internet of Things connections outside of the Azure environment. So it can be that centralized monitoring and management tool for those assets. And then IoT Hub is a managed service that is that messaging hub and works to collect that telemetry data, collect those messages, and feed that information into the Azure environment, into your data services that you're utilizing, and configuring all that information. So, so those are some key things around Internet of Things. And then to tie into that is with all the information for connected devices. Typically, there's a lot of data being ingested through the telemetry of IoT devices. What do you do with that information? And that's where a lot of these big data and analytics pieces come in. The slide actually still says Azure SQL Data Warehouse. Many of you may know that probably around summertime, early in or late spring, they started calling. They changed the name of SQL Data Warehouse to Synapse Analytics. So that is now the name of Azure SQL Data Warehouse, but they are one and the same. So if you are studying for the exam, and the fact that this actually is the Microsoft official content for the Azure Fundamentals exam, so they haven't changed the content, but they are doing that, I think, in November, early November. They are making some changes to the exam, putting new content into the exam. So you may see the change at that point from SQL data warehouse to Synapse Analytics, but understand that they both are one and the same. It is a database essentially that does massive parallel processing. So if you see something around data that mentions massive parallel processing, that's a good indicator that that is SQL data warehouse or Synapse Analytics. So it can ingest data and work with that data on a massive scale. HD Insight works on Hadoop and is a fully managed open source service. So you'll see HD Insights isn't just an Azure service, very similar to like Cosmos DB as well. It works in that Apache environment of open source that all feeds in and is then also does analytics services for enterprises. And then Data Lake's Analytics, and Data Lake Analytics is again another platform-based analytics service for big data. So all of these services, depending on what your need is, whether you're all in with utilizing structured or semi-structured data around a SQL type environment and comfortable with the SQL type of language, then you have Synapse Analytics or Data Warehouse. If you're more into open source, Apache, Hadoop, and those type of services, that's where really HD Insight fits in. And then Data Lake Analytics works very similar to, it works within that whole analytics service and helps to process the big data from that standpoint. So, it's just really important from a fundamental standpoint to understand what's out there, and that's kind of the key around these services, is understanding what is out there within the services within Azure to transform your data. And then we get into the artificial intelligence and the AI type services. And there are many of those within there. And there's not a whole lot to need to know in terms of Azure fundamentals, because there's an AI fundamentals exam now. But understand, the Azure machine learning services are those cloud-based environments that can develop, train, deploy, and track all of your learning modules. And you have within there multiple modules like computer vision, text to speech, and things like that can help, bot services that can all bring together a artificial intelligence and cognitive services environment for your resources, and to work with your data and work with your customer experiences. And then Azure Machine Learning Studio provides a visual workspace to be able to drag and drop, very similar to utilizing just a GUI interface to build your services, build out your bot services and everything. It does it almost in a workflow standpoint, where you can just drag in information and drag in, almost like building a workflow of, if this happens, then do that. So it's very helpful from that standpoint. Then in addition, there's a lot of serverless computing, and when we were talking about the IaaS and PaaS and SaaS, somebody mentioned, what about function as a service? This is where kind of some of those serverless services come into play with the Azure functions and really running infrastructure as code type services. There's still compute services obviously in the back end, but you are just really running code across a consumable environment, rather than needing to have a underlying infrastructure that you need to take into account. It's highly scalable. It's going to create then a infrastructure it's going to create infrastructure based on a specific event. So if you're running a code and you have a webhook or a trigger that takes place, this function will run and execute some sort of JSON or HTTP or some sort of some sort of execution and action that is done by that is taken care of by that trigger. And Azure Logic Apps works very similar, but like I was saying about the AI Studio, it is a GUI based interface to orchestrate tasks, and it makes it very visual, where you have a if this then that type structure. So if you have a trigger that is hit, that you've identified, it then will initiate a workflow and move things from that nature. And then Azure Event Grid works very similar to what we were talking about with IoT Hub, where it will take events, it'll manage and route based on if somebody has subscribes to a particular messaging within your environment, and then can also then take that and route events, and they work in conjunction with, a lot of times, with an Azure function or an Azure Logic app, where it will take that information and route that to to a messaging service, or can initiate a workflow and do many of the same similar things. And then just real quick on Azure DevOps and Azure Dev Test Labs. Just understand DevOps service works with Git repositories and allows you to create development pipelines for continuous integration, continuous deployment work, and you can create Kanban boards for agile processes and Scrum processes, and has a lot of extensive automation. And it's a cloud-based tool, so you can do this on the go. You don't have to have it loaded on your desktop, and you can very easily continue to run your workflows from anywhere. And then Dev Test Labs also allows you to create environments in Azure and control costs through that. So just really important for this particular exam, just to understand what they are, understand the definitions around them. There's not a whole lot of content around understanding the DevOps pieces, but just understand that they're there. And the key one here is really the DevOps, is Azure DevOps, and understanding how that works in terms of your pipeline and controlling your CI/CD pipelines from that standpoint. Then Azure App Services we'll go into a little bit more, and I will show some of the ways to stand this up within the Azure portal here at the end of the presentation. But just understand Azure App Services. Again, you can build web apps or mobile apps with limited interaction with the compute infrastructure. It provides global scale with high availability, depending on what app service subscription you choose, and then handles multiple languages and frameworks. And like I said, we'll go into the portal and I'll show what you have in your selection, like C# or different coding languages that you want to use. It allows for, it has the security and compliance of the Azure environment and Azure Security Center all built into it. And as well, you can utilize Visual Studio to build your applications and deploy them into Azure App Services. It's important to understand the different management tools, and if you've worked in the Azure environment, you may already know these. Azure Portal, obviously a very simple GUI-based interface to create Azure resources on a one-off standpoint, but really to really take on the full benefit of the Azure environment, it's important to utilize a lot of the uh, the code-based and template-based services such as Azure PowerShell or Azure CLI, Cloud Shell. We'll come back to Cloud Shell in a second, but Azure PowerShell and Azure CLI, you can utilize Visual Studio, create deployment templates, and automate your processes to create a standard deployment for all of your resources. So it's important to understand that from a standpoint of just understanding these different management tools for the Azure fundamental exam. Cloud Shell allows you to utilize PowerShell as well as CLI within the Azure interface for quick use of deployments. You really can't deploy templates, but if you have a PowerShell script to run, you can very easily just deploy that within the Azure environment, within Azure Cloud Shell, to get that resource going. The Azure mobile app is very helpful from a standpoint of if you forget to turn off resources, if you're doing dev test and you've turned off your computer for the night or for the weekend, and you realize, oh, I forgot to stop that virtual machine. I've got a virtual machine running, or I've got resources that I need to break down and stop. You can go use the mobile app, and you can also run some PowerShell scripts within there as well. So very helpful from a standpoint of when you're on the go to utilize that. And then as well, Azure REST APIs, the ability to utilize third-party services such as Visual Studio to deploy your code and to connect to Azure resources. Azure Advisor is a free service within Azure that looks at your Azure resources, and we can take a look at this if we have time here at the end as well. One of the key things around Azure Advisor is it, and you can see on the slide, it looks and provides you recommendations based on high availability and resiliency, security, performance, and cost. So it gives you recommendations to maximize your benefits within the Azure environment. So, and like I said, it's a free service. It provides you those recommendations at no charge. A lot of times if you log in and you haven't done anything in Azure Advisor recently, you might even get a pop-up to go to Azure Advisor now and look at your recommendations. So those are some things to know, and they're helpful tools. Azure Advisor is a very helpful tool to help you in these four areas. You want to maximize your costs. You want to make sure that your environment's secure. Depending on what that environment is, high availability might not be the most important to you, but definitely cost and security. I recommend to keep an eye out on those recommendations within Azure Advisor. Always a good first place to go. And we're going to talk a little bit more about Azure Security Center does some of those same things, but Azure Advisor does it based on best practices amongst the entire Azure environment and amongst all of what Azure knows and what Azure what Microsoft has learned from other clients and other customers as well. So let's talk about authentication and authorization and the identity services within the Azure environment, which are a key piece to the Azure ecosystem when you are when you're working with tools and you are creating an environment within the Azure environment to get into Azure and to get into app services and to get into platform services or even Microsoft 365 SaaS services. You have to have an identity in that environment, and the two pieces within that are authentication and authorization. Authentication is you telling the environment who you are, right? You're providing your identification, you're providing yourself, you're providing hopefully multi-factor authentication where you're where you're providing maybe a password and you're providing a fingerprint or or a web app or an authentication app, and you're taking that information and you're verifying who you are, you're verifying your identity. And then the second piece of that is then authorization. So what resources then are you allowed to access once you have authenticated? So you've identified who you are, then are you a user, you administrator, and what do you have access to? And that's what you're authorized to do. So those are two key pieces to protecting your environment, because not only do you want to make sure that only the people that that are authorized or that are known to your organization can get into the environment, but you also want to then know what they are and control what they have access to and what they're authorized to work in when they get to that environment. And that is all about controlling and protecting the perimeter of your organization. So, what the Azure environment and really the entire Microsoft cloud ecosystem utilizes for that authentication and authorization is Azure Active Directory. And what that is a cloud-based identity service. It's important to know and to understand it's not if you are somebody that's worked in an Active Directory environment, it's not Active Directory domain services. There's no forests, there's no group policies. It is strictly a identity and access management service. It authenticates, it can provide single sign-on for an Active Directory service. It provides application management with providing service principals for applications to access other resources within your Azure environment. It also allows for business to business to Azure Active Directory accounts to integrate with each other, as well as business to customer identity services, which is nice because if you and I can use the B2C is a pretty easy example. If you've ever gone to a site and they wanted you to register on that site, a shopping site, for example, and it wants you to, and you can create your own password and register your email on that site, or you can use your LinkedIn or Facebook or Google or Microsoft account to authenticate to that website, and then you get an email from Microsoft if you use your Microsoft account saying, "Hey, you connected this website to your Microsoft account. If you didn't mean to do that, contact us." That's B2C identity services. You're now using that Microsoft account as your identity for that site, and so Azure Active Directory allows you to do that, and you can set up your environment to allow customers to also utilize those services to gain essentially guest access within your environment. And it may only be for your website to allow them to shop on your e-commerce site, but you can utilize that identity service and keep your environment secure from that standpoint, keep an audit tracking of who's accessed the environment. All of those things all go within that environment and within that identity service for that authentication and authorization. And then the last piece here is the device management, being able to utilize, with like say a Windows 10 device, being able to utilize your Azure Active Directory account to then authenticate to that device. Windows Hello is tied into that pretty tightly to utilize your face identification as a form of authentication as well. And I touched on multi-factor authentication. Obviously, many of you probably already utilize this one way or another on something. Key things to know around what multi-factor authentication is it's something you know, something you have or possess, and something you are. So it's important to understand the differences between those, because you will probably get a question around multi-factor authentication on the fundamentals exam, and they'll try and trip you up a little bit in terms of kind of giving you two something you knows. An example of two something you knows would be your password and a PIN. So logging, I'll give an example. Logging into, say, your bank application and giving a password and then giving your ATM PIN are actually two things that you know. They are not multi-factor authentication. You're giving two factors, yes. You're authenticating with two different pieces of information, but it's not truly multi-factor authentication. It might be two-factor authentication, but not multi-factor. Multi-factor would be you're using a password and you're using a Face ID, or you're using a fingerprint, or you're using the mobile app, or you're getting texted to your phone a code, a unique one-time use code. Those are multi-factors and ways to authenticate with multi-factor authentication. So keep those keep those in your forethought when you're thinking about multi-factor authentication and what they are. They're not two things that you can remember, if that's probably the best way to think about it. If you're using a password, then it's not a PIN number that I remember either, or my mother's maiden name, or a security question even is not multi-factor authentication. Important to understand that security questions are used a lot of times for password recovery, but they're not used for multi-factor authentication. So let's talk about some additional security tools. And I mentioned we were going to bring up Security Center today. Security Center is a great tool to utilize, and they provide a certain level of services similar to Azure Advisor as a base free service. When you stand up Azure services, you do get Azure Security Center, the basic free service at no charge. And it puts policies in place that will provide basic security recommendations based on Microsoft best practices. So it monitors those security settings, such as one of the key things is it'll immediately look at your administrator accounts and say, hey, do you have multi-factor authentication? And usually in my development environment, when I'm when I have my test services in my test account, I'm always getting flagged for not having multi-factor authentication on all my admin accounts. That's a number one that pops up. Just-in-time virtual machine access, not having RDP ports open or SSH ports for management, having those type of things. Those are some just baseline best practice security recommendations that you see come through on Security Center. And you may also see those come through on Security Advisor as well. There's probably they're tying probably a lot of the same best practices in there. And then you have the ability then to also automatically apply security policies within tying Azure Security Center into Azure Policy and utilizing those services together to when you deploy resources to add certain extensions to for like antivirus or anti-malware, make sure that have just-in-time virtual machine access be a part of your baseline security posture. Azure Key Vault's helpful. One of the things around Azure Key Vault and something around key security is when an Azure resource is created that might have public access, keys are created within the Azure environment, and those are Azure and Microsoft managed keys from that standpoint. If you require as an organization some level of separation of duties, but you don't have your own key management system, within your environment, or what it's also called is hardware security modules, or HSMs. What Azure Key Vault can do is create a certain level of that separation of duties. Even though it's an Azure service, Azure is no longer managing those keys, no longer has access to those keys, and then they can manage your it'll manage your encryption keys. You can manage your own encryption keys. Have, all your secrets and passwords can be managed within Azure Key Vault, as well as certificate management. Certificate management's a really nice one from a standpoint of being able to automate the certificate renewals of your domains within Azure Key Vault. So that's a key differentiator around Azure Key Vault, and to utilize Azure Key Vault, as well as that separation of duties and keeping that, having a centralized environment for managing all your keys. It makes it easier from a standpoint of your web applications and making sure that your certificates are up to date. Make sure that the resources that web app needs to access, such as maybe a backend database that has your inventory for an e-commerce site, can manage those keys very easily. And if those keys get rotated, you don't have to go in and make modifications to your code as well, because it's just referencing a place within Azure Key Vault. And when those keys are rotated, it doesn't affect your apps as well. So that's another good reason to utilize Azure Key Vault. If you have a lot of web apps that are making calls to other resources and you need to utilize keys, you can utilize Azure Key Vault to make that process much easier to manage and much more efficient. Azure Information Protection, or AIP, is a way to protect your documents, emails, applying labels and apply different methods for protecting information through rules and conditions defined by your administrators. So key things is around to know around information protection is what it is it provide, you can provide and identify such as personal identifiable information or personal health information or GDPR information, and put policies in place that automate those rules and conditions in terms of how that's handled, who has access to that information, what might be obscured from people when they access, what they can't see when they access a document, have it redacted automatically or blocked completely from users, as well as manually. So it integrates as well within the Microsoft Office productivity tools like Microsoft Word, where you can say, where you have a little button on the taskbar for information protection, where you can classify this document as confidential or as a secret, as a secret document. And then only people that have access maybe within the company based on the rules and policies in place can then access that document. So very helpful from that standpoint to protect your information. Same thing with emails. If you put, you can have it automatically apply a label if you put confidential, or if the subject line says driver's license or things like that. It can obscure that information or encrypt that information and require the person receiving that information then to log in to access that information as well. So it's then protected from somebody intercepting that information and accessing something that's sensitive and something that might be detrimental if it gets out to yourself or your organization. And Azure Advanced Threat Protection, also in short, Azure ATP. If any of you attended any of the security sessions at Ignite last month, this has also been renamed Defender, Microsoft Defender. There's multiple flavors of it. Right now, in terms of this exam, it's still called advanced threat protection, but you might see, Defender, Microsoft Defender being utilized a lot more. There's Defender ATP, there's the Defender for identity, so they've put Defender in front of a lot of it and brought all of that into, the Defender for, the Windows 10 Defender pieces, identity protection, advanced threat protection, all of that's going into this whole Defender XDR suite of services that Microsoft's kind of tying together. But the key thing around advanced threat protection is it utilizes Microsoft's global threat database to provide a security solution to detect and identify and investigate a lot of threats, compromised identities, and malicious insider actions. There's a piece called insider risk detection that also all ties into that threat protection. There's a dedicated portal for reviewing, monitoring, and responding to the suspicious activity. It can also tie into a SIEM solution such as Azure Sentinel, and as well as there are sensors that you can put on your domain controllers if you're utilizing a hybrid infrastructure. AD active, you can put their active identity threats through that. Again, this is another cloud-based service, so understand that this is fully within the Azure infrastructure. All right, so I've talked for about 40 minutes. Let's go and talk and do a couple of walkthroughs here. We're going to walk through creating a app service. We'll walk through Azure Security Center real quick, and we'll walk through a little bit of Azure Key Vault before we close out today. So let me pull up my Azure environment here. Oops. And so if we just go in and we look for app services, and we can find it right here, and we create ourselves a new app service. And I'll just put it into an existing group here. Azure App Services is another one of those services, and I think I mentioned it when I was doing a storage account. And a lot of these you can tell because it'll actually put this this URL extension here for your app service that tells you that this is going to be this needs to be a unique name globally within the Microsoft environment. You can't just say, if I just say web app, it's probably going to flag it as, yep, this is not available because it needs to be unique. Somebody else along the line used web app, obviously. So I usually put my own kind of identifier that I utilize within my environment as my standard prefix for everything. So that way I can remember it really easily. And usually it's not flagged. Nobody else is using DN Cloud, and hopefully nobody on this recording or on this call would do that to me and take that away from me. So, but anyway, so doing that, putting that prefix in front of what you want to do helps to protect you and give you that unique name, right? You can publish, again, use a Docker container, as we mentioned, or you can run code and you can see we've got .NET Core, we got ASP.NET, we got Java, we got Node, Node.js, PHP, Python, and Ruby. So whatever code you might be comfortable with writing in, you have that capability. Again, you can also utilize a Docker container if you're comfortable utilizing Docker, and can utilize that on your utilize Docker to create your code. You can utilize that and publish that directly to a web app as well. So so a lot of flexibility in terms of creating a app service and creating a web app. It can run on Linux or Windows if you'd like. You can choose your regions just like any other service, and then you can choose your app service plan. And so if we look at app service plans, there's a lot of different options here, and you can see that it starts free, and then you can go all the way up to an isolated service. And this is where really it defines what your compute infrastructure is going to look like based on your need. The nice thing about it, though, is you can start small, and as you need to, as demand increases on your web app, you can continue to scale that app service up. So you can start it free when you're doing development. It doesn't cost you anything. You can see you can have up to 10 apps on a free tier. You have a gigabit of space, which running code isn't going to take that much space. Key thing here is you're running in a shared environment. You're not you're not dedicating resources at that point. Same thing with the shared. You're getting now more app services. You have 100 that you can run. So if you're doing more and more development, you can do that. Key thing around when you're doing this as well, you can utilize these app service plans for like Azure Functions and some other services that run app services in the back end as well. So as you're choosing that, you can take into account what it is. You can see your costs start to go up here down at the bottom once you get out of that free tier. So it's important to from a cost management standpoint on what you want to do and what you want to take what you want to do within your environment. Key thing is within shared, that's the first tier that you can have a custom domain. So if you want to have a custom domain to utilize for your e-commerce site like captainhyperscaler.com, you have to have at least the shared. And really, you're looking at a little more than a penny an hour for that service anyway. So it's not not going to break the bank on you, but if you're developing a web service that you need to test that DNS is working and that you're routing properly, it might be important that you have that custom domain. Once you start getting up to the basic and standard and premium, you start getting more disk space as well as you get more instances. So you get a little bit more. So you get some more higher level of availability. You also get hybrid connectivity capabilities. So now you can start to connect and utilize app plans and app services that are in a on-premises environment as well. You get a virtual network connectivity once you get into the standard environment. Once you get into premium, you get private endpoints. Some other things that you start getting when you get into like standard and premium are deployment slots. Where you can have leave your production environment up, have a dev environment, and then gradually deploy any new code into your environment once you start utilizing, once you start testing and do even like a partial environment test and things like that. Your most expensive and everything is a fully isolated environment. So if you've got a really globally needed global utilization, high traffic environment that needs to be high performance, high security, highly isolated, then you can utilize the isolated service. Highly regulated environments, GDPR requirements, things like that. You might want to use an isolated environment rather than the shared environment and shared resource. You start getting your dedicated resources once you hit basic, standard, and premium, but still it's in that entire shared Microsoft environment. So if you're highly regulated, isolated might be the way to go. And you can see the different things here. And here if you're doing Docker container, it's going to say next Docker. Otherwise, it's going to say next monitoring. So if I go to next Docker, then here I could work in my Docker environment. then we have monitoring next, and you can put application insights on. We can review and create, and we're good to go. And I'm not going to create this web service right now. I just wanted to kind of show you the different capabilities and things around the web services. So let's look quickly at Key Vault before we get into Azure Security Center, because I want to spend a little bit more time on Security Center, because I like Security Center. Azure Key Vaults, again, creating those services are very easy, just like any within the Azure environment. We have our resource group. We create a Key Vault name. Here we have different pricing tiers. You can see here, standard is utilizing the Azure environment and utilizing Azure Key Vault service with the separation of duties with managing the keys. You're now managing the keys instead of Microsoft managing the keys. If you pick Premium, you can use an on-premises HSM service. If you already have a key management service, you can tie that into Key Vault and utilize the tie-in capabilities that Key Vault has with the Azure resources, but also, again, keeping that separation even further, where now your keys are within your own HSM in a hybrid infrastructure. So you have that capability as well. And you can see, retention. We have access policies here. We can enable access for virtual machines, resource manager, Azure disk encryption. So if you're encrypting your virtual machine, your full virtual machine and their disks, you'd be using Azure disk encryption. We can add policies here. We can use Vault policy and create our own Vault policy, or we could just use the Azure Active Directory role-based access control. You can see that's in preview, so you probably wouldn't be tested on that right now, but know that that's coming. Our networking, we can make it public, private endpoints, and then review and create. And like I said, your Key Vault, we've passed our validation, and we can then manage our secrets, our secrets, our passwords, our keys, as well as our certificates within the environment. And then lastly, as we wrap up for today, is Azure Security Center. And I already have a shortcut to that already in my recents, because I go into Security Center an awful lot. But you can see here, and you can see they've changed Azure Security Center. If anybody's been in Security Center, after Ignite, they reconstructed the entire interface. And a lot of that has to do with, like I said, Azure Defender, or what used to be called advanced threat protection. And you can see within my, when you go into this dashboard, it provides you with some really rich information right off the bat. My Azure subscription is actually a standard subscription rather than the basic subscription, which is the free subscription. You get, when you upgrade your subscription, two things that you don't get right off the bat. When you create your subscription within the Azure environment, you get Azure Security Center, the basic tier, the free tier, right off the bat. You don't get this regulatory compliance, and you don't get this Azure Defender. You have to upgrade to a paid Security Center subscription, which, if you're an enterprise organization, that's something you should do. It's a cost per virtual machine in an IaaS environment, and different costs within the environment. And let me see if I can see our coverage. If I go to edit plan for the Defender plan, you can see here what is included. You have your continuous assessments and security recommendations are still there, and your Azure Secure Score. So that first box on that top left is there, and you can still protect your environment and use those recommendations to protect based on Microsoft best practices. If you're a regulated environment, you require GDPR compliance, and you want to be able to prepare for those audits and understand where your controls stand, turn Defender on. And you can see there's costs based on your app services and your databases of per servers, but $15 a month for what you get is not a whole lot to bear from an organizational standpoint. You get the just-in-time virtual machine access. You get some adaptive application controls and network hardening controls. So if you really are working having a defense in depth security posture, it's very important then that you put the security center. This is called Defender on now and Defender off. This used to be basic and standard. So the terminology's changed, but just understand if Defender on and standard tier is where you get beyond secure score and general security recommendations. You get all those extras that have to do with building a compliant environment. So, and if I go, to my secure score, I can view my recommendations right in here, and it'll tell me what I need to do. And like I said, I think I told you guys already, I always get hit that MFA is not enabled for owners and for, I have it for accounts with right permissions, but not all of my owners have one subscription that, I have, in my subscription don't have all my owners. Again, vulnerabilities, vulnerability assessment on my virtual machines. The nice thing about Security Center is there's capabilities here where you might be able to just click on quick fix and remediate that and increase your secure score right off the bat. Otherwise, there's other things that, like say disk encryption. I don't have Azure disk encryption on my virtual machines. Well, here it tells me exactly what my steps are. Here are my instructions. I can go right to Microsoft Docs, get my directions on how to do that. So if there's not a quick fix, it at least gives you the directions to do it. And here I can actually trigger a logic app and monitor those subscriptions and those resources as well. So Security Center is a very powerful tool within the Azure environment, and something that you really should understand if you're managing the environment. If you're managing an Azure environment, understand the power of it, understand what you can do with it. They've simplified it a bunch since Ignite as well. There used to be five different menu areas here. There used to be three different sections on the overview. They've really made it much more user-friendly to utilize. The regulatory compliance I love here as well. You can look at the say ISO 27001, and it's outlined exactly like the sections of ISO 27001 with your A numbers, your A6, your A5, and you can see what's grayed out is because I don't have any resources that comply or require those controls in place. But in A6, you can see within my internal organization, segregation of duties, you can see where you might not be compliant. So if you're getting ready for an ISO audit, you can come into here, review where you're red. I have no problem with backup, but logging and monitoring, I'm not event logging on my virtual machines. And I can come in and I can remediate these problems, get these to green, get this entire ISO 27001 compliance section to green, and then you're ready for the most part for your audit that's coming up for ISO. And there's others that we can set up. We can manage our compliance policies within our subscription and go to security policy and add more standards within here. And you can see, from a UK standpoint, we have the UK controls here. I'm waiting for GDPR to show up on here. I'm sure it will eventually, but it hasn't yet. We have HIPAA High Trust, which is a United States healthcare capability. We have NIST, which is the national security standard in the United States as well. So we have a lot of big benchmarks here and security capabilities within the environment. So let's see. So that brings us to the end of this section and this grouping. So we've gone through essentially in the last 3 weeks 75% of what's needed for the Azure Fundamentals exam. So so I welcome, you know, anybody, anyone that's studying for the exam, feel free to reach out with any questions or anything. If we don't have any questions right now, you know, I believe that oh, I didn't put the ideathon slide up, but I believe Marco wants to talk about the ideathon. I'm going to post as well a link to a presenter, to a survey for this this session. So if you could, it's a Metrics That Matter survey on my presentation. If you could please fill that out. It helps me with my Microsoft Certified Trainer designation and my renewal. So I'm posting that right now. But if Marco, if you want to talk real quick about the ideathon that's coming up this weekend, you're on.
Sure, Dwayne. Thank you very much. This was very interesting presentation. I really enjoyed it. I hope the other people did as well. Basically, yes, we do have a couple of announcements. I just posted on the chat. You can see there are several, I would say, the big ones coming. The big one, which I wanted to say, we have a Cloud Lunch and Learn Ideathon. It's basically online challenge that's going to bring people together to work together on building ideas to solve real world problems. Basically, you don't need to worry about the coding skills. Implementation will not be a part of this challenge. So this event is meant to be inclusive for everyone, even the non-tech, such as me, for example. So you just need to bring ideas, and there will be amazing prizes coming as well. The crucial thing about this is going to be to design the solution with your team. So there will be a team of 4 or 5. So basically, you can sign up individually, or you can, which means you will join the existing team. Or you can sign up with your own team. You can bring the friends or colleagues with you and take the opportunity to apply your knowledge and skills to solve this challenge. It's in the chat, so you can feel free to follow that. Feel free to follow the link there. The rest, before we finish, I want to let you know, as Dwayne said, next week is the last session of this Azure Fundamentals series. Is going to talk about security, business continuity, governance, and subs. And the link is there as well. Today, we have a third session about the Kubernetes series. It's going to be after 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, I think, the Irish time. It's going to be monitoring Kubernetes. So again, if you are interested in learning something more about that, feel free to check that. It's in the chat. And on this Friday, we have a session about the governance and the automation series, Introduction to Azure Policy. So just in case, if you need or if you have any questions, feel free to reach Dwayne or feel free to reach Cloud Lunch and Learn. You can find us on the YouTube, on Twitter, or whatever we have as well, website. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dwayne, for delivering this great session. And thank everyone for joining. And feel free to reach us. And I hope to see you next week again. Dwayne, if you want to say something for the last, feel free.
Oh, no. Like you said, on this slide, you can reach out to me on social media if you have any questions after the session or when you start studying for this exam. I'm happy to help out. So thanks everybody for attending. I know there was a question on these recordings. I think you can access the previous recordings if this is the first one you've attended. The previous 2 are on the Cloud Lunch and Learn YouTube
I wanted
channel.
to say, Dwayne, before we still didn't upload the previous session because we will upload everything at once, and it's going to happen probably next week.
Okay. So everything will be available after we finish the 4 session.
Yeah, exactly. So you can feel free to reach out. This is the answer to this question. Yeah.
Subscribe to the Cloud Lunch and Learn channel, and when they're all uploaded, you'll get a notification. You'll be all set.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. So have a lovely day, and see you next week then. Yeah.
Sounds good. Thanks, everybody.